NATO Secretary General is speaking in the Ukrainian parliament in front of the Ukrainian MPs who are urging to speed up the Ukrainian NATO support, Ukraine-NATO Membership Act, talking about the lethal weapon and all other issues. But in all his addresses, Jens Stoltenberg tried to send the message that NATO doors are open to Ukraine and there is a strong cooperation. And there is a lot which depends on Ukraine. It's first of all the fight against corruption, focus on reforms. Somehow he also said that he should credit that some of them are really moving forward. Also the talks about that Ukraine can reach NATO standards way earlier, and that would be good for Ukraine. Pretty tough words on Russia, support for territorial integrity of Ukraine, condemnation of the annexation of Crimea and the presence of the Russian support to the separatists in Ukraine. There are no really doubts that there is a hybrid warfare, that Russia played its card. So all this reassurance. Also, Jens Stoltenberg mentions that there would be the support on the cyber defense for Ukraine. We know some things are happening, and also he thanks to the Ukrainian military who fights, and some of the wounded would also get the support from NATO. Yet the demand of the Ukrainian society is for more clear answers, as in this part of the world, in this environment, inaction is considered to be a provocation for the threat from Russia. So in very short time, we try to address these the issues to get more clarity. So that's what it is. Secretary General, focus on reforms, meet NATO standards, fight corruption. Though, so I'm quoting you. That's a very extremely important message. While we are in an environment when there is more focus, the easiest to achieve goal. So would you name one or two priorities, especially for NATO, regarding those issues? For instance, civil oversight of a Ministry of Defense or something like that, one or two.
The most important thing is to be successful in the fight against corruption, because corruption is hindering and hampering all the other efforts. That's the reason why we have something called Building Integrity, which is a NATO program where we work together with Ukraine on how we can advise and help Ukraine being more successful in the fight against corruption. NATO cannot solve that problem for Ukraine. It has to be Ukraine and Ukrainian leaders that solve the problem, but we can help, we can support, and we can share the experience and advices we have from other countries which have made progress in the fight against corruption.
A few times, many times, you've mentioned the NATO door is open for Ukraine. That's a part of your message. While a lot of the Ukrainian, including Ukrainian politicians, not like that, urge, like, can we speed up? When we would have the, how we can develop with the Ukraine-NATO membership action plan. And there is a legitimate concern that inaction in our part of the world, it provokes those who threaten. We do have this experience. So really, what would be this answer? Understanding that might be the Ukraine would join NATO way later than Ukrainians expect. But what would be this policy? How would you define Ukraine-NATO relations within the nearest future? Would it stay the same, or there is anything planned?
The plan is to strengthen our partnership and to work more closely together on many different areas. For instance, on cyber, we are doing a lot and we are stepping up. NATO will provide equipment. We will strengthen the cyber defenses of key Ukrainian institutions, help Ukraine to do so, and also helping Ukraine to develop capabilities to investigate and to attribute who is behind the different cyber attacks. That's one area where we do a lot and where we can step up and do even more, and it's extremely relevant as a response to hybrid threats, hybrid warfare. Then we are also doing a lot when it comes to meeting NATO standards, interoperability, meaning how Ukrainian military forces can strengthen and improve the way they're able to work together with NATO forces. That's good for Ukraine, but it's also good for NATO. On the membership issue, the main message from NATO is that it's a sovereign decision by Ukraine whether it wants to apply or not, and then it's a decision by 28 allies on whether NATO is ready to enlarge and to have a new member. No one else has the right to interfere in that process. The President raised the issue of a membership action plan. It was not discussed in depth, but the main issue is that Ukraine already has the tools to make progress moving closer to NATO with the comprehensive assistance package, which is a wide-ranging package of many different strands of cooperation, and we are following up and implementing all these strands of efforts.
Deterrence and defense, that's what always mentioned. And there was a decision to deploy 4 battalions in Poland and the Baltic states. We extensively covered that as a journalist and pay attention to that. But right after that, there was the announcement by the Russian side, by the President, Minister of Defense, to deploy 30 battalions to the western border of Russia. Then later there was issues about the divisions and even tactical battalions. So what can NATO and what can you do to stop this spiral, at the same time ensuring the safety of those who are there?
For NATO, it is extremely important to respond in a measured and proportionate way. And there can be no doubt that when NATO now is increasing our military presence in the eastern part of our alliance, in the Baltic countries and the Black Sea region, that's a response to the aggressive actions of Russia in Ukraine. No one was discussing this kind of military presence in the east before Russia illegally annexed Crimea and started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So we are responding, but at the same time we are responding in a proportionate and measured way, because we don't want a new arms race, we don't want a new Cold War. Russia is there to stay, Russia is our neighbor, so therefore we convey the message of defense and dialogue. We need to be firm, we need to be predictable, but at the same time we need to try to avoid tensions escalating and creating an even more difficult relationship with Russia.
Do you think you're successful in that?
I think that without the measured but firm response of NATO, we would have a much more uncertain situation in Europe. By deploying troops to the eastern part of the alliance, we are sending a clear message that an attack on one NATO ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance, because these forces are multinational, and thereby sending a very strong message of deterrence, a multinational response to any attack against any NATO ally. At the same time, we have been able to re-establish dialogue with Russia, and I think that's important, because especially when tensions run high, it is important to talk.
There would be Russia would have the military trainings in Belarus this autumn called West. So we heard from especially the Baltic partners, they are concerned. Do you share that concern? Would there be any NATO observers? How would you treat that?
We will monitor and follow the Zapad exercise closely. All nations have the right to exercise their forces, but they should do that in a responsible way, and they should of course do it in accordance with international agreements and regulations, for instance, and commitments, for instance, the Vienna document, which is a document that requires international observation and notification of big military exercises. And we call on Russia to do exactly that when it comes to the Zapad exercise.
If you speak about the trusts created for Ukraine by NATO, what could be improved in their work in terms of transparency, quality, and the speed of use of those funds allocated there?
For us, transparency when it comes to the use of the NATO trust funds is fundamental, and therefore we are transparent on what we do in Ukraine. And actually one of the purposes with some of the funds and some of the NATO programs and activities is to create more transparency, is to be extremely open on what kind of activities and programs we are working for here in Ukraine.
So almost we have very short time to answer that, but we've listened carefully, I've been and listened to President Trump talking again and again last time in Warsaw on the 2% of the GDP of the NATO members, which is good for allies. At the same time, there are worries by the NATO members about unclear positions sometimes of the President Trump. You're in a position where you have to put the allies together. You don't need to confront or alienate anybody. But still, what would be your message to the US leadership to make this cooperation easier also for the partners? What are your concerns?
So my message is that it's absolutely possible to have a very ambitious but also positive message on defense spending, deterrence and NATO's collective defense. Because we are starting to deliver. European allies are now actually starting to really increase defense spending for the first time in many, many years. Over the last 3 years, total defense spending across Europe and Canada has increased by around $46 billion, which is a significant amount of money for defense, for investments in equipment and capabilities. When it comes to partners, I strongly believe that a strong NATO, collective defense, deterrence in Europe, help to stabilize the whole of Europe. So it's also, of course, important for countries like Ukraine, Georgia, countries in the Western Balkans who are not members of NATO, but of course they benefit from the stabilizing effect a strong and predictable NATO has on the whole security situation in Europe. And some of the money we invest in defense is also spent in programs and activities where we work together with Ukraine in modernizing, improving the armed forces of Ukraine, because we strongly support the independence and the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
So no concern with the US?
US is committed to NATO, and that's not only in words but also in deeds. The US is now increasing their military presence in Europe for the first time in many, many years. And I think the fact that the US is leading one of the battalions, the battalion or the battle group we have in Poland, but also are increasing their military presence in Europe on top of that, with more funds for exercises, for pre-positioned equipment, supplies and forces. I think that's the strongest possible sign and commitment to NATO and to the US security guarantees for Europe.